All right. Well, welcome to Christian Virtual Fellowship, the online church for allegiance to the King. And if you're watching this or listening to this online, we invite you to check out our website at a2kchurch.org. That's the number 2k church.org. You can find out more about us and what we're all about. And if you are a biblical Unitarian that is isolated, does not have a local church to go to, this is what this online church is all about. It's a place for isolated biblical Unitarians to have a church home. So tonight I want to talk about the root of bitterness. We're going to look at Hebrews chapter 12, and we will start there. I got intrigued a while back. Somebody, I don't even remember what the context was teaching on this. They were teaching on something. I don't even remember what it was they were teaching on, but they quoted this verse in Hebrews 12 that mentions a root of bitterness. And so I thought, I I have always just when I read that verse or I've heard somebody say it, I just always think in terms of, you know, being careful not to allow bitterness to crop up in your heart, that kind of thing. But I realized I don't really know if that's what it's talking about or that's what it means. And so I decided to look into it and discovered that no, it does not mean that at all. That is not what it's talking about. So let's read the verse first. It's actually a couple of verses, verses 15 and 16. This is Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. That there be no sexually immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his own birthright for a single meal. So I'm going to give you the the long and the short, or the short of it first, and then we'll do the long of it. The short of it is the root of bitterness is talking about unbelief. That's what it's not talking about having bitterness in your heart or something like that. It's literally talking about unbelief. And we're going to see that both in the context we'll read around it, as well as the writer of Hebrews is actually referring back to Deuteronomy 29, where um, this command comes from, and a warning where this warning comes from. So let's look at, first of all, at the rest of not the whole chapter, but we'll look around it a little bit. So if we go back up, in the beginning of the chapter, it's, the whole book of Hebrews is warning about unbelief, and, this idea of turning away from God, because it's not talking about unbelief of people who've never believed in the first place. It's talking about people who turn away, who develop this unbelief. And so, he begins the chapter, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. So let's not go down this road of turning away, and let's stay focused. Goes on, he's gonna talk about discipline and the fact that we need discipline. We needed discipline as children. We need the discipline that comes from the Lord, and to not look on discipline as a bad thing, but as a good thing, that it's necessary for our maturing. And then it's going to get down to, let's see, verse 12. Therefore, strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, and make straight paths for your feet, so that the limb which is impaired may not be dislocated, but rather be healed. Pursue peace with all people and the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. And so that's all the stuff leading up to this verse 15. It's talking about basically we need endurance and we need discipline and uh, focus and all this kind of stuff. We don't want to be entangled with the things of the world and that lead us away from God. We need to stay focused on God. And when we are being disciplined by God, we need to view that as something necessary for our spiritual development and our continued wholeness under the covenant that we've made with God. And then we're, we're supposed to think in terms of I need to do the hard work of making sure that I am um, strengthening myself instead of allowing my faith, instead of allowing me to be knocked off of that faith. When it gets down to 15, it then says, see to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many become defiled, that there be no sexually immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his own birthright for a single meal. For you know that even afterward, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no place for repentance, though he sought for it with tears. So he uses Esau as the example, and specifically this thing that happened where Esau's out hunting. He comes in from the field. He's hungry and tired and whatever. And Jacob has made some, I think it was like lentil soup or something. And so he wants, um, Jacob to give him some. And Jacob says, I'll give you some if you sell me your birthright. And Esau is like, yeah, 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 that's fine. Give me the soup, right? So what does that tell us about Esau? It tells us that Esau did not believe that he was going to get an inheritance, right? That the idea, so you kind of step back a little bit, get the bigger story. Hey, Lisa, would you let him, Lisa, Lisa, would you let him in? He's scratching, banging on the door. Thanks. Um, the uh Abraham had been given the promise of the land, right? That Abraham's inheritance was all of this land, right? And it actually goes from Egypt all the way into what would be modern day Iraq, right? All the way up to, Turkey and down to, um, the top part of what is today Saudi Arabia. That whole area was promised to Abraham as his inheritance and his descendants' inheritance. So he passes on this promise of God to Isaac, and Isaac believes the promise that this is our inheritance. Well, along comes Esau and Jacob, and Esau is willing to sell that promise for a bowl of soup. So it tells you Esau did not believe because he didn't value it. He didn't think it, he didn't believe this promise. At the time, they're sort of nomads in a foreign land. The only land that they own at all is a little patch of ground for burying their dead. And so he's just like, he's looking at it with his eyes. He's like, there's no inheritance. There's no promise here. I'm not going to get my birthright. And so obviously Jacob does believe because he's like, hey, he probably knew that Esau didn't really believe, and he's going to get him to sell it to him for a bowl of soup because he doesn't think it's worth anything. And Jacob obviously did believe. So, so that is the example that he's giving regarding it's he also includes sexual uh, immorality as well, but he calls him a godless person, right? And so we get from the story, what is a godless person? It's a person who doesn't believe, right? A person who's turned away from God's promises, from trusting in God, all this kind of stuff. We'll get into a little bit more on what this word is, this unbelief word, and what does it mean. But as we allow this whole context to go back in, to verse 15, see to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. So the root of bitterness, let's go look at that for a minute, and then we'll come back here and we'll see that this is talking about turning away from God and unbelief and this kind of stuff, and that it's also a um, it has impact on people other than just the person who is not believing. All right, but first we'll go to Deuteronomy chapter 29. Deuteronomy chapter 29 is an interesting chapter. It has all these curses. It's actually, I highly recommend, if you've never gone and studied the curse of the law, which is in Deuteronomy in the this later, chapter 29, and there's some other little things going on around it. It's a big laundry list, and it's pretty specific. And towards the end of it, this is what God says in verse 18. So that there will not be among you a man or woman or family or tribe whose heart turns away today from the Lord our God to go to serve the gods of those nations, that there will not be among you a root bearing poisonous fruit or wormwood. This is the root of bitterness, right? And I actually started thinking, bitterness is actually probably not a good translation for us. We really should translate it a, a root of poison or a poisonous root. Because part of what we want to see in this idea is that it's damaging uh, in its fruit, right? That's what it's producing, is this poison. Okay, so again, that we can see from just this verse alone. I'm not going to go into the rest of the chapter, but you can see it where it's talking about that all this curse is about turning away. If you turn away from following your God and go chasing after all these other gods and going your own way and doing your own thing, then all these curses are going to come on you. And the reason I'm telling you all this is so that you won't do that. That you won't have among you a root that's bearing this poisonous fruit, the root of bitterness that springs up. All right, so going back now into Hebrews 12:15. So we've seen from the context, we've seen from where this is coming from in Deuteronomy. We can now see that what it's talking about is this unbelief. And I wanted to let me do one more thing, and that's I want to take this word unbelief that I've been using, and I want to define it real quick. I'll give you a few other verses where it appears. It appears in a number of verses in the New Testament. It's the Greek word apostia, and it has several meanings. The two that are pertinent here are an unwillingness to commit oneself to another or to respond positively to the other's words or actions. And then the second is lack of commitment to a relationship or pledge unfaithfulness. And I think these both kind of go together. That it's basically this unwillingness to be committed. And in this case, it's talking about you have the existing relationship that you're supposed to be committed to, and you're walking away from it and being unfaithful to that relationship. Um, in Unbelief has a pretty good definition, I think, as long as you remember it's it's not I'm not believing a set of propositions. It's that I'm not believing in the relationship and the promises, and I'm not believing the curses and those kinds of things. I don't believe God, and so I'm going to go my own way. Um, let's see. I've got a list here. Let me pick one out. Um, Here's one. Romans 4:20. Yet with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith, giving glory to God. Um, Here's another one, Romans 11:23. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. So you remember it's talking about that you've got the olive tree, which represents Israel, and the branches are the people, and God has cut them off because they were unfaithful. And these faithful Gentiles, he's grafted in to this olive tree. And now Paul's going on to say, but hey, if um if they don't continue in that unbelief, they come back to faithfulness and trust in God, he'll just graft them right back in. So this is kind of the thing. And then Hebrews 3 has a verse. We'll come back to this and spend a little bit of time here in a minute. Take care, brethren, that there not be in any one of you an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God. And then he uses this apostia again in verse 19. So we see that they were not able to enter into the promised land because of unbelief. Okay. So this word, it means to turn away from the relationship, to be unfaithful to the relationship. In terms of our relationship with God, it includes not trusting and obeying Him. We're kind of going to go, do our own thing. So let's take all this back into, again, Hebrews 12:15. See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. So we can see what he's talking about is this unbelief, this unfaithfulness, not trusting God and kind of going my own way, not following him. You can think about the Israelites grumbling against him, and stuff like that. You can think about, you know, being sexually immoral, for instance, is violating his commandments. I just want to do my own thing. I don't care about his commandment. I want what I want, right? And but but look at what it says. It says that the root of bitterness, this when unbelief springs up, it causes trouble and defiles others. The word defile it's an interesting word. It basically defile is a good English translation. We don't need to go into all this the Greek word and what all it means and stuff like that. Defiled is a good translation, but we need to get the cultural understanding of the word into our head, because the word is being used culturally at the time, and it may be a little difficult for us to connect to the meaning of it. So in the common Greek language of the time, in the Greco-Roman world, this word had communal understanding. That the idea is if you are defiling something, it's because you are going against and breaking the uh the community's um expectations, and especially where your God is concerned. So for example, in the early Christians were persecuted pretty severely, and a primary reason that they were persecuted is because they wouldn't participate in the communal sacrifices that the cities and towns and communities at the time would have throughout the year, sacrificing to, the main gods, the local gods, to Caesar, and, all this kind of stuff. They wouldn't do it. And once they were no longer seen as Jews, because the Jews had official exemption from this, but later, once it was seen, okay, these guys aren't, the Jews are all telling us that these guys aren't Jews. They're not part of us. Um, at that point, the expectation, well, okay, then legally you have to participate in these sacrifices. You're not exempted like the Jews are. And so when they won't do it, the people are considering they're defiling our community. And what happens when your community gets defiled? What you want to think about is you're you're doing something that's an affront to that God. And what's going to happen? That God's going to get mad and he's going to do bad things to your town, right? Maybe a plague is going to come, or maybe your crops are going to fail, or maybe, a volcano is going to go off, or whatever, right? Or fire in Rome is going to burn down, a large part of the city. And they're thinking, wait a minute, these Christians, their lack of participating, their unbelief is defiling the rest of us. It's making us unholy by association, and God is going to punish us too. If you think about in Old Testament covenant, it's it's like becoming unclean. Like you did something to become unclean and you need to go ceremoniously clean again, right? Similar kind of concept. So back in Hebrews 12:15, this unbelief, that this turning away from God or being disobedient to his commandments or not following his ways or whatever, that it can bring trouble to the community and defile the community. I was talking with Dan Gallagher about this subject, and he brought up the analogy of a barrel of apples. Right? We've all heard this before, right? You get a big bowl or big thing of apples, and if there is a rotten apple, it will start to rot the apples around it, right? And this is what this is talking about. That poisonous root of unbelief affects the community. Let me give you a few examples. I'm going to give you two examples of this concept, because there's a lot of different ways that you could think about unbelief and how that might manifest. I'm going to give you two, and then we'll open it up for discussion, and we're going to talk about the subject as a whole, as well as maybe other kinds of unbelief that can affect other people in the body of Christ. So the first is that unbelief dampens the power of God. So, for instance, in Matthew chapter 13, In verses 53 through 58, we find the story of Jesus going to his hometown of Nazareth, right? He's been doing all these miracles, all this other place. Everywhere else he was going, every single person who came to him would get healed, right? Verse 53. When Jesus had finished these parables, he departed from there and he came to his hometown and began teaching them in their synagogue, with the result that they were astonished and said, "Where did this man acquire this wisdom and these miraculous powers? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is his mother not called Mary, and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? And his sisters, are they not all with us? Where then did this man acquire all these things?" And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not dishonored except in his own town and in his own household." And he did not do many miracles there because of their unbelief. So, in other words, here comes the Messiah, full of power, miraculous healing power. He's been going all around to places, healing thousands of people, and he comes to his hometown and doesn't hardly heal anybody, just a few people. I guarantee you there were lots of people in that town who needed his healing, who needed his miracles. And yet, but their unbelief brought that root of bitterness, that poison, and just dampened the whole thing. Here's another example. This comes from Mark chapter 5 and verses 36 through 42. We're going to see Jesus doing something about unbelief to get it out. He's going to pull the apple out of the bowl of apples. Verse 36, but Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, only believe." So he was going with this official to go heal the official's daughter who was dying, and he gets word that she has died. The official does. And then Jesus says to him, "Do not be afraid, only believe." And he allowed no one to accompany him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw a commotion and people loudly weeping and wailing. And after entering, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him. But putting them all outside, he took along the child's father and mother and his own companions and entered the room where the child was in bed. And taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which translated means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astonished, right? So look at what he does. He comes in, he's like, you got to understand something. Sometimes we don't see this. Like, it's not that like he comes in and he's some stranger. By this point in time, he's not a stranger to anybody in the region, right? Everybody knows who this guy is. Remember, the father leaves to go get him. He's discovered he's here in town, and he's like, here's the solution. So he leaves this group of people that are there and he goes to get him. These people knew who was there, right? And why he was there. But they don't believe, right? They don't believe. They laugh at him. So what does he do? Throws him out of the house, right? Get out. I don't need your unbelief in here dampening things like Nazareth. And then he brings her back from the dead. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, in verses 19 and 20, it says, "Do not quench the spirit. Do not utterly reject prophecies." And this is the thing, is that when we have this unbelief, we're certainly not going to be manifesting the power of God in our lives. But here's the thing. What we see in Hebrews is unbelief around me can do that as well, right? All right, let's look at a second one. Another example of a kind of unbelief, this not believing in the promises of God and and turning away from him in some way. And it doesn't have to be that I'm not, certainly someone who completely rejects God and walks away from the faith is committing this unbelief, but it doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be that they leave the church. It doesn't even have to be that they leave the idea that they're following God. It has to be that they've turned away and they're not trusting and believing in what he has said in some area, and they will have unbelief in that area. A big one is disobeying the commandments of God. So if God has given us a commandment and we disobey the commandment knowingly, willingly, then we don't believe him. In Hebrews chapter 3, we read this earlier, verses 18 through 19. And to whom did he swear or we read, I guess, close to this. And to whom did he swear that they would not enter into his rest, but to those who were disobedient? And so we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief. So they lost out on the promise of entering because of their disobedience. Their unbelief was disobedience. He just, literally had given them these commandments, and a few days later they're disobeying him. But then he's going to put up with that, and they're going to let him into the land, and they send the spies in. The spies come back. Think about this. 12 spies. There's, I don't know, hundreds of, upper close to a million, maybe more than a million people of these Israelites that came out of Egypt, right? This is a lot of people. 12 spies go into the land, come back. 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, they're like, this is going to be great. I mean, look at what God did to the Egyptians. We're going to go in here and God's going to give us all this great stuff. It's this land that he promised to Abraham that belongs to us. God is going to kick these people out. And they deserved it too, because they were horribly evil. The other 10 give this evil report, right? It says this bad report. And they're like, oh my God, the people are giants. They've got these huge walled cities. They're just going to destroy us, and they're going to take our children, our wives and our children into slavery. We should go back to Egypt, right? They don't believe the promise, right? That they're going to turn away from it, right? God told them, go into the land. I will be with you. And they're like, nah, we're going to go back to Egypt. And so he's like, all right, you're not going to go in. In fact, you're going to die here in the wilderness. And again, millions, I don't know, somewhere between, say, call it 600,000 to 1.5 million, somewhere in there. It's a big number. 10 bad apples poisoned hundreds of thousands of people, and they died in the wilderness. Okay, here's another one. This is Titus chapter 1, verses 15 through 16. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure. But both their mind and their conscience are defiled. They profess to know God, but by their deeds they deny him, being detestable and disobedient and worthless for any good deed. So in other words, when we disobey him, we're not obeying his commandments. It doesn't matter if what we profess. Doesn't matter how I say I'm a Christian. Doesn't matter what I'm believing about that. Like I used to believe in once saved, always saved. None of that matters. What I profess does not matter. My actions are what matters. And if I'm being disobedient to his commandments, then I have this unbelief has crept up in me and defiled me. And I think of, with this one, um, that I think about this main commandment that we have as Christians: love one another as I have loved you, self-sacrificially. And this is Jesus's main commandment, right? This is the big one. And you think about his some of the things that he says in the letters in Revelation, and I think about the one, I think it's Ephesus. I could be remembering wrong, and I don't have it in my notes, but I think it was Ephesus, where he talks about that they left their first love. And if they don't come back to it, he's going to remove their candlestick, which is their church, right? He's going to wipe out their church. And this is serious business, right? To obey this commandment, love one another as I have loved you. And some commandments are really pretty easy to recognize when you're disobeying them, right? If you're committing adultery, I don't think anybody's confused, right? You're probably not confused, and no one else is confused. There's no question, right? If you're stealing things from people, yep, on and on, right? That so some disobedience of commandments are like that. Love one another as I have lived, self-sacrificially. Well, what does that look like? Right? Is it possible that I am actually violating that commandment with my actions and not realizing it? Could be. I think our individualist culture here in the West causes us to violate that particular commandment all the time. And so again, look at what it says. It says, both their mind and conscience are defiled. They profess to know God, but by their deeds deny him, being detestable, disobedient, and worthless for any good deed. Right? So going back to Hebrews again, this root of bitterness, whether we're talking about unbelief towards the power of the Spirit or unbelief towards a commandment or maybe a number of commandments, where I've turned away, my actions are showing where my heart is, and maybe it's greed and I'm being greedy or something. I am becoming defiled. I am the root of bitterness. And I am going to affect my brothers and sisters around me. So this is a big deal that I kind of want to open it up now for questions, discussion. If you have other examples that you think are really good, I'd love to hear those as well.